This is the latest 14-inch MacBook Pro with the M2 Max chip on the inside. I'll be comparing this with the M1 Max and share with you the results so you can make the best decision choosing a computer that best fits your workflow. Let's find out. This is ArtIsRight. If you have been following the channel, thank you. I'm back to holding my 12.9-inch iPad Pro on hand again, and I'll be sharing you a lot of results. If you're new, welcome. There's a lot of information I'm going to share, and I highly encourage you to watch through the beginning part because this will give you context as to why we test the way how we do it. And I'll also leave timestamp in the description below as well, so if you want to jump ahead, you can do that. And as always, I highly encourage you to pause the video so you can analyze the result yourself. Now with this said, I want to give a quick shout out to this display. This is BenQ latest Mobius EX480UC. It is a 48-inch 4K display, 120Hz refresh rate, and it has a OLED technology on the panel. So this is really awesome, super awesome black. I'll be doing an unboxing video soon, so make sure you stay tuned to the channel for that. All right, with this being said, I have a few machines on order that I coordinate with my clients and everything. However, I'm only able to get my machine in because there is some shipping delay. So what I have in right now is the 14-inch MacBook Pro, and this is with the M2 Max chip. For this one, I just ordered the base configuration for the Max, so it has 12 CPU, 30 GPU. There is another upgraded version that has 38 GPU, but one thing that I also want to point out is that between the Pro and the Max, once you have reached that 12 CPU, it is the same 12 CPU in the Pro and also in the Max. So there are many tests that will just look at CPU performance, and we're going to get a pretty good idea how these CPU perform in this preliminary testing. This has 32 gigabytes of memory and 1 terabyte SSD. And you're also going to see as well where the memory bumps comes in and benefit the system. So you can really see based on the workflow I'm sharing, which one may fit best with you. The other machine that I have for reference is the 16-inch MacBook Pro. This is the top M1 Max. 10 CPU, 32 GPU, 64 gigabytes of memory, and 2 terabyte SSD. This is a custom built to order machine. And I will also add in another reference machine, the M1 Ultra. So the M1 Ultra has 20 CPU, 48 GPU, 64 gigabytes of memory, and 1 terabyte SSD. This is the stock configuration for the Ultra as well. As always, Apple have divided their chip into two different groups. So there is the more consumer leaning one. This is M1 and the M2 chip. And then there's the M1 or M2 that follows with the suffix, the Pro, the Max, the Ultra. These are generally more Pro-oriented. So they are going to be able to do more things. For instance, link to more displays, have higher memory bandwidth, have more memory on board, all those things. So these are things to consider when you are thinking about purchasing your machine. And there is a reason why they call it Pro. And even though you can use the consumer leaning one to do a lot of things and it's quite impressive, if there are certain things that you need, for example, displays or extra display link up to the system or something like that, this is where you would consider the next chip in the lineup. So as usual, my approach to this will be from a pro photographer perspective, one that does video because you're watching my channel right now. And I will hear a lot of comments, I'm sure, that import, export time doesn't really matter to me. I leave the computer running, but here's the thing. It matters to my workflow, and I know that it matters to them as well when you can get to the images quickly, for example, the import preview. And the other thing is that these metrics give me a way to compare the machine using actual data as far as how the computer is performing rather than how I'm feeling the program is, rendering the previews or as I'm going through the edits and everything. For the most part, on all these machines, you're going to get a fairly smooth experience out of them. But if you really want to see these machines push hard with multiple display link up to it, I've done extensive testing on multiple display with the M1 machines, various ones. I'll leave a link in the description below so you can check out that video and see when the experience may not be as smooth anymore. Now, some of you probably have the question, should you get the higher spec or the max out M1 Max chip or get the mid-tier current M2 Max? Because at this point in time, you can get the M1 Max on the refurbished site, and some of the sites are probably clearancing these machines out. So it's probably a good idea to maybe get the M1 Max, but we'll find out in the actual data what we think about all these things. Now, the other thing too, the way how I'm testing this is using single application. I'm not doing multitasking because I am more interested in how this chip from one generation performed to the next. And the best way how I can do that without any biases is to just pretty much using a single app, running everything on the same variable, so the same set of test images, the same actual software, the same OS version and everything. So these are all highly controlled and they're run in a way to just really see how the performance improvement are. And I want to talk about one more thing, which is thermal throttling. So some of you will probably say, I'm not going to get the 14-inch because the Max one's going to throttle and everything. Let me simply put it this way. It's really just by design so that the chip doesn't overheat. And I would approach these machines and configuring them and choosing them based on your workflow and what you need. And don't worry too much about the granular detail because, I mean, from the outside, this is the M2 Max chip on the inside, and they're pretty much exactly the same with the M1 Max, M1 Pro and everything, although the Pro one I think is a little bit lighter machine weight wise, but nobody's going to really know the difference. And chances are when you're really using it, you may not notice it's different either. So those are the things to think about. My initial impression of these machines is that it's pretty much just the same. It's exactly the same. I don't feel that OS or anything runs any faster like that at all. So that's just my thing. I think that this is more of a iterative generational upgrade where it's just like it's the next gen. It's going to provide some performance improvement, some upgrade. For example, HDMI is now 2.1, but beyond that you're really still looking at a machine that is very similar to the previous one, just some spec bumps. Design Go is exactly the same. Next up is SSD. So based on my testing, this is the one with 1 terabyte SSD with the M2 Max chip. So far, the speed is good. In fact, it is the highest out of the rest, but it's about only 200 megabytes per second faster than the M1 Pro chip that I have. And I mean, all these speed tests, you're just testing it at a moment in time, so there are some variables, but this gives us a good idea as far as how the 1 terabyte is performing. So here's the thing. I think that once I get the 512 gigabyte in, we're going to see some speed that may drop, and I already hear a lot of different site talking about this, that is an issue, it's going to affect performance. Based on my testing, it doesn't really affect the performance. I'll leave a link to this video up here and also in the description below. And I can tell you right now that most pro apps right now, for example, Lightroom Classic, Lightroom, Final Cut Pro, really just peaks out at any given time, maybe about 400 megabytes per second at the very most, and that's not always consistent. Most of the time is running below or at around like maybe 100 to 150 megabyte per second, especially for Final Cut Pro with 4K videos I'm shooting anyway. Now, if you're using compressed, it may use a little bit more of like the disk read and write, but I really feel that for pro workflow, especially for photographers, it's not going to make a difference whatsoever with regards to SSD speed. So I wouldn't really worry about this metric so much at all. A lot of videos are going to make a lot of fuss about it. I'm going to tell you that it really doesn't matter and it doesn't affect overall performance based on numerous testing that I've done. But watch that video out. It's going to tell you a lot. And there's another thing to consider too, is the speed versus the size. I mean, if you're configuring your machine with 256 or 512, if you have high speed SSD, right, you're going to feel that much faster on the disk when you're copying. And the other thing that I'm also been saying since the very first generation M1 Pro, M1 Max chip is that it's really hard to really saturate that bandwidth downloading files to the computer, because external SSDs right now, they go about like 2,000 megabytes per second, and the cards that we have from our camera, CF Express, is maybe around 1700 megabytes per second. But in order for you to saturate that, you need to really download 2 or 3 cards at the same time. And if you're shooting that much, if that's your workflow, then obviously the 256 or the 512 with the slightly slower SSD is not the one for you. So there's a lot to be said about the way how you work through the system as well, and the size of the SSD relative to the workflow. So that's just another thing to think about. Next up is RAM. How much should you configure for your system? That's a great question, and I get this all the time. I don't mind answering them at all, but the best thing you can do is examine your workflow. Are you crazy like me, have multiple tabs and also multiple browsers open while multitasking with many creative apps? And if you are, get more RAM in your system. Also think about the way how you work with your machine, and also if you're using one or multiple machines. For example, if you have a desktop laptop workflow and your powerful machine is the desktop, like me, then you may configure your laptop with less memory and you're going to be okay. The other thing I also want to note too is if you're coming from Intel and your current one has 32 gigabytes of memory, I would configure it the same and not go down, just because it is a unified memory architecture, it is faster, it's sharing between CPU and GPU. The physical memory that you have been using and you're used to are going to still be the same. So I would encourage you to configure it the same, if not more. Now, the best thing you can do to examine the way how you're using your RAM in your system is that start up the system or restart the system, launch Activity Monitor, and go into the Memory tab and monitor the memory pressure. If you're in green, you're fine. If you're in yellow or in red, you should probably consider getting more RAM on your system when you're configuring this. The thing about Activity Monitor is you have to look at it in real time in a way, and the history graph only go back so far. So the other app I like is iStat Menu. I'm not affiliated with them by any means at all, but I've been using them for years now and I love their app. So they keep track of your memory pressure and everything, and you can just have that in the menu bar, and you can do it by hourly, 24, 7 days, and 30 days history. So you can get a glimpse into how you're using your computer and how often it peaks. And I really like that a lot. All right. So is 16 gigabytes enough for Pro? I would say that if you are the single app, or you just have like a web browser with 4 tabs running and you just launched, for example, a creative app to do editing, when you're done, you close that app out, you shut down the computer, you're running like single app at any given time, I think you're going to be okay. But the moment you start to do multiple apps, especially for example, Lightroom and Photoshop, and you're working with large files, I would definitely consider getting 32 gigabytes. And I'm always advocating this, that as a pro, you should really consider getting 32 gigabytes anyway. I made this argument on the M1 series machine, especially with the M1 Pro, M1 Max, comparing the difference between the two, how at 16 gigabyte, when you really start to push it so much, it starts to lag a little bit, especially in Lightroom Classic. That same argument is valid today. I'll leave a link to that video in the description below too. All right. So here's a few things to note, and what you're going to see is this is the way how you're going to read the specs in my chart that are coming out. This is a computer model. This is a chip on the inside. This is the CPU core, and this is the GPU inside the system, memory, and also SSD. So let's put down MEM and SSD. So this is how you're going to read the chart going forward. All right. So with this, let's take a look at Lightroom Classic. We're going to compare the M1 Max versus the M2 Max and see how they perform. This is running macOS latest Ventura 13.2 as of this filming, Lightroom Classic 12.1, and both of these machines, and all the ones I'm testing and showing you here anyway, support full hardware acceleration. Okay, Lightroom Classic 1:1 preview. This is impressive. This is a big bump for the M2 Max versus the M1 Max. Now, attributing to this big bump are a few things. One of them is the way how Lightroom Classic is using the CPU inside these machines. Notice on the M2 Max on the left there, everything is full, is saturated on every single one of those cores. Throughout the entire export on the M1 Max, this is what I'm noticing. A lot of gaps, things not being utilized fully. So I'm not really sure what's going on, but I think this is also attributing to a lot of the speed variations that we're seeing in the other chart. Now with this in mind, we're seeing a 47.77% improvement between the M1 Max and the M2 Max. But don't get too excited, because I think the other graphs are going to paint a very different story. All right, now let's take a look at this. And we're going to add in one more machine, and that is the M1 Ultra. So the M1 Ultra is still pretty much blowing all these machines out of the water, and it's doing this in 9 minutes and 17 seconds versus 13. Now, here's the thing. The M1 Ultra is not saturating all the cores either, and you may argue that the M2 Max is pretty much giving the M1 Ultra for the money. I mean, kind of is, and also kind of not at the very same time. So let's take a look at the export result. So 1,000 files, and by the way, these are the same control group Nikon D850 files, 45 megapixel raw export to JPEG full size that I have done always, and this is pretty much the same file that I've used in my other tests on this channel too. And we can see that for Lightroom Classic export, utilizing both CPU and GPU in this export task, the improvement based on the current version of Lightroom Classic right now, we're seeing a 9.66% improvement. We're not even seeing like the 10% market. We're not seeing the 20% improvement that we're even expecting. That's based on my prediction in the initial configuration video that I released. This is the reality of a system. And based on this so far, you're also going to see later on why maybe having the M1 Max with 64 gigabytes will be more beneficial if you work with a larger file type. So let's add in the M1 Ultra, and you can see that there's really not a lot of compromise there. This is under 5 minutes. It's pretty much still more than half the time that it takes the M2 Max to export. Granted, yeah, this does have 48 GPU, and Lightroom really go in and utilize that along with the 20-core CPU. So there is a case still to be made about the M1 Ultra. And if this is your workflow, if Lightroom Classic is your workflow and you're constantly going through a lot of files at any given time, I would probably just look at the M1 Ultra, because that's going to be a machine that's worthwhile, especially if you're going through all these files. It's going to pay itself off in pretty much no time at all. All right, let's take a look at Lightroom Classic HDR Merge. And between these three machines, I mean, the timing, a second, 2 seconds apart, I wouldn't worry about this much. They are about the same. What about Panorama Merge? This is taking 14 Nikon D810 file at 36 megapixel to combine them into a 314 megapixel DNG file. This is where having more memory on the system, it's going to be a benefit. 64, and you can see that the Ultra is running about 3 seconds faster. Not a big deal at all, but it is faster. But you can see that jumping from 32 to 64 gigabytes definitely cut down in time. So think about the tasks that you're doing as well. Use what I'm sharing with you right now as a guide to determine if you're going to need these extra RAM and if this is going to be more beneficial. So far, we see that if you have to configure these two machines and they are priced similarly, I would choose the previous M1 Max chip with 64 gigabytes of memory, because that's going to speed up some of the tasks significantly, especially if you work with a lot of large files. Next up is Lightroom. I am running version 6.1, and this is the cloud version of Lightroom, by the way. Comparing between the M1 and M2 Max that both support full hardware acceleration on export, we can see some interesting results. So this is the top M1 Max, and it is beating out the base M2 Max by a little bit. The attribution here, I think, has to do with the extra 2-core and also 64 gigabytes of memory. And I do have the top M2 Max with 38 GPU coming in to run the test. So I'm going to reserve what I think about that machine until I really see the result. But something to note about Lightroom Cloud version as well is that this export engine really targets CPU, GPU, and RAM all together in a very intensive way compared to Lightroom Classic. And that's the reason why I think that the older version, or the previous M1 Max, is running a little bit better on this, because it has more of those resources on the system. And once we add in the result from the M1 Ultra, it starts to paint a very different picture. I mean, this export time is almost half Lightroom Classic for the same 1000 file. I wish Lightroom Classic was really that fast, but you can see that there's really no comparison between the Max and the Ultra. So again, think about your workflow and how much raw files you go through and how much you export. If you do a lot of these, Ultra definitely is still a great contender to think about. Next up is CaptureOne 23 version 16.0.2. Let's take a look at the result. So for this, we're seeing an improvement of around 9%. And that attributes to about 1.5 minutes faster, just about. So with this, the attribution, I would say, because this is really using CPU, having those 2 extra core does help. As far as are the cores running faster, I would say probably not as much, and you're not going to see the experience of a much faster core on this, because if you take a look at the CPU chart in CaptureOne, the way how it's utilizing a CPU on import, I mean, it barely peaks past like the 30% mark on each of the cores. So I don't think it's really pushing the CPU as hard as it can. And this has always been my consistent complaint about CaptureOne, and I really feel like they should really go in and bump this up so that the previews are faster, but they have not yet done this. And multiple versions of CaptureOne that I have tested. When we throw in the M1 Ultra, this confirms our result a little bit, that having more core does help, but the speed of the cores probably not going to make too much of a difference. The number of cores itself will make much more of a difference when it comes to the import speed, although maybe not as much when you really compare like the price variation between these chips. So these are things to think about. When it comes to exporting, CaptureOne really predominantly just targets the GPU on the system, and this tells us a couple of things. Number one is that the GPU inside the M2 Max is more power than the M1 Max that have come before, because Max have 2 more cores, yet CaptureOne was able to export on 30 cores at around 8% faster in performance. Again, that really attributed to about 1.5 minutes in performance. So not really quite the drastic number we're thinking of. And when we throw in the result, for example, from the M1 Ultra, you can see that it's performing just exactly the same. And having 48 GPU, again, this is the point of diminishing return in CaptureOne. I already said this with the M1 Max when we're comparing the 24 versus the 32 GPU option, that for CaptureOne, get the 24 because that's going to be the best for the performance. I'm going to venture a guess right now and say that this 30 GPU option is going to be the best option for CaptureOne as well. No need to really go up more because the program can't really go and utilize it anyway. Now let's look at Photoshop test result. And as usual, I'm using Digital Lloyd Chamber test that he has devised. I'll leave a link to his website in the description below. These are the 3 tests that I'm going to be running from his. It's the speed test, the medium, and the huge file test. Now, some of you may say that, yes, it is a huge file. Who use that? There are some that do. So I'm actually doing these tests to also test the RAM out on the system as well. And for any of you that work with large files, well, now you have your answer too. All right, so for speed, comparing between 70 and 90% RAM on the M2 versus M1 Max, just about the same on those. Adding the M1 Ultra in, speed comes really close to each other, not that big of a difference whatsoever. We're talking about milliseconds. We're not really going to see any variation on these whatsoever when we're really doing a workflow. What about if we bump the file size up to medium, 15.7 gigabytes? These are fairly large files, and we start to see some numbers jumping around a little bit. What I'm really more impressed with on this one is when we bump this up to 90% usage of the memory, we get a timing that is decreased. Now, this may seem like a lot, but if you really think about this, this is a scale in terms of just seconds. So we're talking about 4 seconds, 8 milliseconds down to under 4 seconds. In real world usage, you're not going to see this variation whatsoever play out in any way at all. Throwing in the M1 Ultra, you still see that number is a little bit shorter, but realistically, that number is not noticeable by human. If I'm not using a computer to measure these results, they're pretty much going to feel just about the same throughout. And this is where having more memory on the system is going to be helpful. So if you're constantly working with large files, maybe not 56 gigabyte, but a lot of large files, composite layering in Photoshop, I would definitely venture out to go get the M1 Max with more memory rather than getting the M2 Max with just, you know, the baseline 32 gigabytes of memory. So and that really shows us a clear picture about the way how these machines are performing. This is just really using, for example, the RAM and the CPU, but more so the RAM on the system to do all these scratches. And next up, what we're going to do is talk about Final Cut Pro because I do use this program. Let's see if the encoder in this chip is that much faster than the one that come before. So all from Final Cut Pro. We can see right now that the timing export for H.264, this is a 10-minute 4K 8-bit 420 from my Panasonic S1 clip that's been cut and arranged together on a timeline. Export these out. They're pretty much within the margin of error of each other. Only a few seconds. Not a big deal. HEVC 8-bit. So there's some improvement in the HEVC export. But again, it's not quite as much as we really want to. It's not half or anything like that. It is about the same. So for most video performance, if you're going to buy this machine, between the M1 and the M2 generation, they're going to be just about the same what we're seeing right now, or with regards to the Pro and the Max chip anyway. When it comes to ProRes 422, interestingly enough, the M2 Max and the M1 Ultra perform exactly the same. The M1 Max does lag it around by a little bit, but that's only like around 10 seconds. I would still consider this within a margin of error. You're not going to see that big of a variation, especially when we're considering this is already a 10-minute video. So what does this all mean? Well, I think the best way to answer this is to approach by some of the questions you may have. First of all, should you upgrade? This really all depends. If your current machine serves you well right now, I would just keep it. There's really no point to upgrade. But if you're going to upgrade because you need more SSD capacity or you need more memory in the system, well, I would think a lateral upgrade to another M1 Pro or another M1 Max chip may be appropriate. And this way you can get more for less money. because on Apple refurbished site, you can probably find some of the M1 Pro, M1 Max machine. You can also find these Pro, these Max machine from the M1 generation, probably on clearance in some of the stores, or they're going to start to clearance soon if they have anything in stock. And this will be a great time to buy these machines. Also, for anyone who may upgrade, they may sell their machine in the secondhand market. That's also another opportunity to get the M1 Pro, M1 Max machine at an amazing price. So I say upgrade, but I say very carefully that sometimes a lateral upgrade in the same generation chip just with more RAM or more SSD may be better. But if you want the latest and greatest, get the M2. But as we're seeing right now, the performance improvement between some of those, I mean, we're seeing a slight step up in performance. And I think that when we go into like the M3, M4, M5 generation, we look back, it's going to be a huge jump in performance. But we're going from one generation to the next right now. And we're starting to see those kind of slow steps up, those bumps coming up in memory. So those are things to think about. So here's another question. If you're looking for a machine today, should you get the higher spec M1 Max or the mid-tier spec M2 Max? That's also another really good question. So personally, what I would do is configure a machine in the M1 Max variety, just based on just the Max alone, the one that has more memory on the system, the one that has more RAM, and especially if you can get the same price between the mid-tier M2 Max and, for example, the higher memory M1 Max, I would go with the higher memory M1 Max, especially if you're doing tasks that can utilize a lot of those memories, such as Photoshop or Panorama Merge in Lightroom. Those are the tasks where it's really going to make a difference having more RAM on the system, rather than having a slight improvement in speed on the chip itself. And just remember, with all these, there's really no one size fits all. So my recommendation is to really look at your workflow, to examine your workflow, to see how you're using the computer so that you can make the best decision for yourself. And if you have any questions, you know you can always leave them in the comment section below this video. If you want something specific for me to test, you can always let me know as well. Give this a like, subscribe, and hit the bell if you're new, and in art we trust.